This is a good time to create our first piece of LabVIEW code, tying together the information we just learned about control and functions palettes as well as the tools palette. First, let's begin on our front panel. We're going to create a typical Hello World example where we're just going to display Hello World in a string indicator. So recall that we have our control and functions palette, the control palette which belongs on the front panel and the functions palette which belongs on the block diagram. So since we want to display Hello World in a string indicator, that's going to belong on the front panel. So by right-clicking, we've brought up our controls palette. I'm going to pin it down. Just move the front panel slightly to the side so we have a little bit more room. Notice how in our modern category we have a variety of choices. We've got numeric, Boolean, string and path, array and matrix, and others. We'll talk about most of these controls later on through the training. Now we'll go right into the string and path sub-palette. We'll select it. See, we have a variety of controls and indicators listed here. A really important point to understand is the difference between a control and an indicator. A control is an input to the program, and an indicator is an output from the program. If we were to continue the analogy of a piece of instrumentation, a control would be a button or a knob or a switch, and an indicator would be something like a display or a gauge or a graph. Because our Hello World program is going to generate an output, we're going to use the string indicator. When we select an item from our controls palette, and then we hover back over the front panel window, we see that an outline of the indicator that we've just selected is moved around with the positioning tool. When we click again to let it down, it has created now our string indicator. Notice how the label of the indicator has been automatically selected. We're going to now just rename that to be Hello World Output. Okay. Now let's quickly go back to our block diagram and see that automatically created has been this pink rectangle. The pink rectangle has the same label, Hello World Output. Every control or indicator on the front panel has a matching terminal on the block diagram. Now, what we want to do in this code is write an output to this output. We want to write Hello World to it. So notice how, again, when we've switched from our front panel, where we have our controls palette, to our block diagram, where we have our functions palette, our selections and our subpalettes differ. That's because we have different objects which we can place on the front panel versus that which we can place on the block diagram. So what we want here is a string constant. So if we look in our programming's category, under the string subpalette, there are a variety of items here. We scroll down and we see we have a string constant here. I'm going to select that, and again, when I hover over the block diagram, LabVIEW automatically moves this object with us. Because it is a string constant, I can simply type into it, and now we have our string constant and our string indicator. So now let's go back to the front panel and we'll run the code. Recall from the quick tour of the menus that we have a run button here. Let us click the run button, in which we'll execute our code. We select run from our menu bar, and notice how our program hasn't worked. We do not have any output in our string indicator. The reason for that, if we go briefly back to the block diagram, is that we've created a constant, we've created our output, but we have not connected the two together. In a standard programming language, we would use an equals function to assign a value to an indicator. In this case, we have a different analogy. We have our wiring tool, which must be used to connect objects, controls, functions, and indicators together. So when we select our wiring tool, we first click on the constant object, and then we click on the indicator. And what this has done now is created a connection. This is equivalent to an equal sign. So when we push the run button now, we see that the value of our constant has been transferred into our indicator. So now that we have a very simple Hello World working program here, let's go briefly through the tools palette and observe how each of the different tools behaves. Let's start again with the finger tool, the operate value. Here, when the operate value hovers over a text-based object, we have the ability to change its value. So we can go in here, We can say whatever we wish. However, when we click on the indicator, nothing happens. Next, let's choose the Position Size Select tool. This time, when we hover over the string constant, nothing happens. We have the ability to select it, but we cannot change its text. However, when we click on it in this way, we have handles appear on the edges, which allow us to either resize or reposition the object. Similarly, when we select the indicator terminal, we have the ability to move it around. Next is the text tool. In this case, again, when we click on the indicator terminal, nothing happens, but when we click inside the string constant, we immediately have the ability to edit the text. Another important feature of the text tool is that if we click anywhere in our block diagram, we have the ability to create free labels, which allow us to create nice documentation to explain what we're doing. Okay. Next, we saw the wiring tool. The wiring tool allows us to click between control and indicator terminals, as well as functions. Our shortcut menu is equivalent to right-clicking on an object. And when we click on different objects, we see that we get different context menus coming up, which give us the different options available to that object. For example, for a string object, we can change it to password display, which changes our string text to asterisks. It's important to note that this context menu is equivalent to right-clicking on an object when we have one of the other tools selected. Next, the hand tool or the scroll window. When we click and drag in the window, allows us to reposition all the code and essentially just scroll around in the window. The next two tools are for debugging. First is the breakpoint. The breakpoint, which looks like a stop sign, allows us to click on any wire and create a breakpoint. Notice that once a breakpoint has been created, when the breakpoint tool is active, it turns to a white icon when we hover over an existing breakpoint. That allows us to easily add and remove, toggling the existence of the breakpoint. Let's leave the breakpoint on and again run the code. Notice how here we're in a paused mode. When LabVIEW encounters a breakpoint, it pauses the code and allows the user to interrogate and debug the code. To continue the code, just click the pause button. The next tool is the probe tool. With the probe tool active, when you click on a wire, a probe window appears. And this allows us to debug code by interrogating the values on wires anywhere in our diagram. Notice now that when we run it, the breakpoint fires, and the value that existed on that wire is displayed in our probe. The next tool we'll look at is the paintbrush tool, otherwise known as the set color tool. With the set color tool active, when you right-click on a region, a color selector box is displayed. This allows you to choose from a variety of predefined colors, as well as a history of your most recent colors, system colors, and a color picker that allows you to define your own colors. So by right-clicking and choosing a color you wish to use, that color has been made active here. And now whenever we click on an object, we can apply that color to it. Again, if we right-click, we can change the color that we want to use. And notice how different objects, different regions of the code can each be assigned to a different color. The eyedropper tool, otherwise known as the Get Color tool, allows us to select on any region and pick up the color that has been applied there. Then when we switch back to our Set Color tool, that color that we've just picked has been made active. In this section, we discussed the LabVIEW environment. We talked about how to start a LabVIEW project, the status toolbar, LabVIEW menus, control and function palettes, and we discussed the tools palette. Plus, we did a Hello World example which tied all of these concepts together.